before I start, I have like a public service announcement that I've been asked to give you. I know it's at the end of the day, probably should have done this earlier, but just so you know, the emergency exits are are to the left and behind you, and this is particularly for the millennials in the room. If at any point the mobile connectivity drops below the levels you're expected, if you take the Wi-Fi code out of the pouch, put it into your phone, breathe normally, and please apply the Wi-Fi code to your own device before attending to the devices of children. Does that work?
Yeah, that kind of works. You talk on
Cool.
while I get this up and running for you.
So I guess like my job today is to talk about what we've talked about, which
Keep talking.
which is an interesting one. I was like, okay, great, no preparation, perfect. And then I freaked out because I'm like, oh crap, now I can't prepare for this talk at all. I guess that was our like millennial Maslow's hierarchy of needs there. It's funny, in like being this sort of tech digital native, first when trying to print this took me 40 minutes, changing toners and cartridges, and now figuring out the slides. We'll see if this kind of works. So I guess to start off kind of properly, our world today is a tumultuous tension between certainty and uncertainty. On the one hand, technological advances have ensured that more knowledge than ever is within our grasp. The phone that's in your hand has more processing power than NASA, and that got someone to the moon. In business, analytics and AI are transforming what was once an art now into a science. But on the other hand, uncertainty at the individual level has never been higher. How can we try and figure out our place in the world when the world is spinning faster than ever around us? What are we to do when the job for life is gone and when jobs are being threatened by automation? 2016 is an interesting time for Ireland. 100 years on from the Easter Rising, it doesn't take much to see that there's another rising going on around us. As I walked to the conference today, like many of you, I saw the cranes and scaffolding dominating the cityscape once again. This year's graduating class of 2016, when throwing their hats up in the air in November, can, I think, for the first time in a while, see quite clearly where the hats are going to land, and they kind of know where things are going to be. We have more and more world-leading entrepreneurs coming out of this little island, whether that's Isel Ward of Food Cloud, Des Traynor of Intercom, or John and Patrick Collison of Stripe. We're continuing to punch above our weight on the world stage. And it's not just tech. Just up the road, Colin Harmon's 3FE is a world leader in coffee. 2016's Young Chef of the Year was Mark Moriarty, a Dubliner with Kerry origins. And Saoirse Ronan has been storming it up on the silver screen. And that's not to mention the rest of the people that we've had here today. From established leaders like Paul Dreschler and Stephen McIntyre to emerging ones like Rosa Langhammer and Emily Levy. The future is bright. It's an exciting time to be in business, and I'm very excited to be speaking with you today. So all that being said, why am I standing here? You'll see in the program that I'm here to give an overview of what we discussed today and talk through some of the key takeaways. You see, this is 2016. We live in a world where our focus has shifted to shorter content. We've moved from books to blog posts, speeches to Snapchats, ancient texts to awesome tweets. And speaking of tweets, I've just added in my little Twitter @symbol. I feel very stereotypically millennial. I actually just originally had my name on it before this, but I saw Stephen McIntyre's talk this morning and thought it looked really cool, so I wanted to be like Stephen and add it in. I thought that was a touch screen. Oh no. Have you seen that video? There's an amazing video. I'll tweet it afterwards. There's this baby who's playing with an iPad and like touching and pressing. The baby's like 2 years old, and then the baby is like having this great time gurgling away. But then the baby's given a magazine, and the baby starts crying and freaking out because they're trying to like squeeze and pinch and zoom in on the magazine. It's terrifying, but also hilarious. Oops. There we go. So I think both emoji and that @symbol say a lot. They contain imbued context and shorthand symbols. I think that's the way our world is going. The symbolism in shorthand is becoming more common, but there's still some way to go. Take, for example, the call header on Andrew Burke, the Dean of the Business School, about doing this talk. Andrew asked me to act as rapporteur for the event, and I jumped at the opportunity. Well, that's not exactly true. I actually jumped straight to Google to figure out what a rapporteur was. So I saw this definition, and I said to Andrew, okay, great. You basically want me to give the TLDR. And you'll see all my editing in this for whatever it is. And I think Andrew maybe did the same thing that I did and immediately jumped to Google and figured out like what a TLDR was for this millennial term. And I was like, a TLDR? Too long, didn't read. In case you guys want to decipher text and stuff, that's what that is. So Andrew was like, okay, great. We want the TLDR version of the future of business. And I was like, okay, great. Future of business, done. Yeah, Andrew wasn't too happy when I suggested just doing that. Speaking of regretting decisions, I couldn't help but panic when someone today mentioned this quote from Warren Buffett. It takes 20 years to build a reputation and 5 minutes to ruin it. Being 23 years old and approaching 5 minutes into this talk, I can't help but be slightly concerned. I still can't figure out how to make this full screen. So my job is to sum up the future of business. And again, like all millennials, I'll go to Google to figure this out. But what is the future? We can see here that it has two meanings, and we'll take a look at both of them in turn. But I think the aspect of uncertainty is an essential component to defining the future. And it's something that came up a lot today, because we're uncertain about what's next to come. Whether that's if we're going to have somewhere to live, or if we're in a tech bubble, or if we're all going to be replaced by robots by the time next year's forum rolls around. But this isn't a new phenomenon. Sure, tech is the latest trend, and as Stephen McIntyre told us this morning, Ireland is in the vanguard for this tech. But we've always been in flux over the latest uncertainty, and we're constantly facing the future. Stephen also mentioned his father and contrasted Stephen's world with that of the world before him. With that in mind, let's go back to 1959 for a minute. That's what Google gives you when you search for 1959. I'm not saying that Stephen's time was 1959. I don't think he'd be too happy if I said that. But because I'm a millennial, anyone over the age of 29 is pretty much the same. That's a joke, of course. Anyone over 30. We're taking a trip back to 1959 to talk about C.P. Snow. C.P. Snow is an English chemist and novelist who also served in the British Civil Service. And in 1959, he gave a lecture called The Two Cultures. In this lecture, he discusses the dichotomy between the sciences on one hand and the humanities or business on the other. Although he first gave this talk almost 60 years ago, if we replace his focus on physics, which was like the hot discipline of the day, with computer science, today's new trend, his words ring true as ever. So in the lecture and a follow-up book, Snow discussed how we can be so certain within our own remit, yet totally blind to things outside this own narrow paradigm. And when reading Snow, I couldn't help but be reminded of that eternal divide in Trinity, between the arts block and the Hamilton, and that's cropped up a couple of times today. So this is C.P. Snow. A good many times I've been present at gatherings of people who by the standards of the traditional culture are thought highly educated and who have, with considerable gusto, been expressing their disbelief at the illiteracy of scientists. Once or twice I've been provoked, and I've asked the company how many of them could describe the second law of thermodynamics. The response was cold. It was also negative. Yet I was asking something which is the scientific equivalent of, have you read a work of Shakespeare? I now believe that if I had asked an even simpler question, such as, what do you mean by mass or acceleration, which is the scientific equivalent of saying, can you read? Not more than 1/10 of the highly educated would have felt that I was speaking the same language. So what we're seeing here is that the certainty of modern science goes up, and the majority of the cleverest people in a certain discipline have about as much insight into the other discipline as their Neolithic ancestors would have had. So in Snow's lecture, he goes on to discuss how we can maybe build a bridge between these two cultures, between science on one end and between humanities or business on the other. So think of the PAV, described by Stephen McIntyre today, as that magical place of rainbows and unicorns. That could be a good bridge. But I think that bridging intention would actually end up looking like an awkward teenage disco, with best students on one side and like science students on the other and no one talking to each other. Later theorists conceive of something called a third culture, and their theory is that the people with real value are those who can bring the two cultures together, themselves acting as that bridge. These people can do things that either of the two cultures by themselves cannot do. So let's look at an example. We see this in self-driving cars. You probably know that Google and other companies are spending billions of dollars developing self-driving cars and employing thousands of technologically minded computer scientists and other technical people. You may not be aware, however, that these companies are also hiring a lot of philosophers to consider questions like how should the cars react in crash situations, which is very similar to the Ethics 101 trolley problem. Those who've done best might recognize this from first year. Speaking of problems, earlier in the entrepreneurship panel, we heard about how the best businesses solve big, real-world problems. In other words, we should focus solely on creating the business equivalent of a pill, something we need, and not a vitamin, something that might be good for us. The problem is that not all businesses and not all startups solve big problems. The tech industry is viewed by some people as a Schrodinger's cat. And I know it was said earlier that the internet isn't just cats, but there are some great cats on the internet. In this narrative, tech is superpositioned to be both failing at solving society's big problems by building things like Uber for cats or Airbnb for dogs, and at the same time seeming to have an overbearing influence on society. It's observed to be either or at different times, usually by the same people, but to suit a particular narrative at a particular time. For context, and the scientists in the room might know that I'm referencing the thought experiment by Austrian physicist Erwin Schrödinger, in which a system stops being a superposition of states and becomes either one or the other when the observation takes place. He proposed a scenario with a cat locked in a steel chamber, where the cat's life or death depended on the state of a radioactive atom, whether it had decayed and emitted radiation or not. According to Schrödinger, one interpretation of this experiment implies that the cat remains both alive and dead until the state is observed. Now, those of you who attended one of the panels downstairs may have noticed that an experiment like this is going on, I think, kind of downstairs beside that panel. Now, maybe CP Snow is correct, and I, as a lowly business student, haven't made any sense of what that experiment is, but I think that's kind of an approximation of what we're talking about. We heard quite a lot about uncertainty today. Stephen McIntyre talked about the necessary uncertainty that millennials are facing as they dive into the world. This hit home particularly hard at me, because the next company I work for probably doesn't exist yet. Stephen also talked about how millennials are mischaracterized as lazy and narcissistic, and I agree that this is a mischaracterization. In fact, I was tempted to write a scathing blog about this, but I got distracted by trying to pick the best Instagram filter for my podium selfie. Now let's go back to the future and take a look at the second definition. Back to the future. So, this definition of the future centers on uncertainty, or at least someone's conception of certainty. As Paul Drescher said earlier, it is vitally important to develop a clear vision of the future, to be able to describe clearly where we are trying to go, and to involve people in developing this transition plan. For Stephen McIntyre, this was to use a compass and not a map. So, to conclude, what do we learn today for certain? We learned that some things are eternal. Stephen McIntyre quoted the Greek philosopher Socrates, who said that the millennials of ancient Greece had awful manners. And that quote made me think of another ancient Greek, my friend Sisyphus. Sisyphus was punished by the gods for his bragging craftiness and deceit by being forced to roll an immense boulder up a hill every day, only at the end of the day to watch it roll back down and having to repeat this action every day for all of eternity. The story of Sisyphus is a good thing to conclude on, I think, because as we look into the future today and see what we learn, it all comes back down to Sisyphus. So, what did we learn? We learned that there are some things in the future that we are certain of, and we will all have these immense boulders in the future to roll, and that we all need to roll them up the hill. We learned that we might be living in dingy bedsits dug into that hill, yours on daft.ie for only £5 a month. We learned that people can find their genius doing the things they love, and that those who can figure out how best to roll a stone up a hill will be on the cover of magazines. We learned that businesses will use freelancers to do some of the stone rolling for them and measure their progress in defined outputs. We learned that alongside freelancers, we'll have artificial intelligence doing some of the stone rolling for us. And finally, we learned that if you want millennials to do some of your stone rolling, just give them some meaningless social validation counter that they can use to compare their stone rolling with that of their friends. So, to conclude, are we facing a solely dystopian negative future? I don't think so. That's my thinking face. Why not? Because I believe in the future. I believe in the youth of today, and I believe that they are the leaders of tomorrow. For that belief to come to fruition, however, I need your help. Paul Drescher said today that Trinity allows us to study in the past, live in the present, and prepare for the future. I'd like to conclude by asking you, the Trinity community, to help build that future. The number one way we can navigate the future, in fact the only way we can navigate the future, is by getting help from others and helping others in turn. So when I look around this room and I see people at every stage of this journey, each of us at different points of the hill, some starting off and some further ahead, wherever we are, however, we each have our own boulder to roll, and we each have things to learn, and we each have things to teach each other. Belief in the future is what drives us forward. Things should be better, things can be better, and with your help, things will be better. Thanks so much.